guys, welcome to my channel. This monthly wrap-up for March is going to be a little different from my usual wrap-ups because I only read 2 books this month. Not saying anything bad necessarily about either of these books for my reading slump, because I definitely started out the month in a slump. And the first book I read was Dry by Neil and Jared Shusterman. Jared is Neil Shusterman's son. And this book was actually really enjoyable. It's a YA, I guess, would be the best age range, maybe middle grade to YA book. Kind of set in the near future, where the question is basically, what if, due to the droughts and fires and those kind of issues in Southern California, they have to shut off the taps there? What would that kind of natural disaster look like? So it was a really interesting, fast-paced book that was a really cool kind of survival look at what would modern life become if the water was shut off, basically. And I like Neil Shusterman, so I kind of went into this, with fairly high expectations, and it was a perfectly fine book. It just took me forever to get through it because I just wasn't really feeling much up to reading. The second book that I read this month, I wanted to focus more on because it was a true crime book, and besides discussing some of the issues I had with this book, we can also definitely discuss the case that this book looked at. So the second book that I read was The Lazarus Files, a cold case investigation by Matthew McCow? Whatever. Anyway, so before I get to kind of critiquing how this book handled the case, I want to start off by talking about the case itself. So in this book, we follow the murder investigation of Sherry Rasmussen and kind of look at how the LAPD handled her case. Basically, more or less what happened is, and I hope that I get the details right, I'll try to be a little vague because, again, it took me forever to read this book, so things that happened at the beginning of the story are a little bit fuzzy. But her husband comes home, I believe, from work, and her husband, they've only been married for a few months at this point, her husband has not been able to reach her on the phone all day, and her secretary at work has not been able to reach her on the phone all day, and everyone thought she was staying home because in the morning she told her husband, John, that she felt sick. But what happened was when he got home, he finds the garage door open, and Sherry has been pretty much brutally murdered in the home. She has 3 gunshot wounds to her chest and abdomen, and a bite mark on her arm, as well as blunt force trauma to her face, I believe. And basically, the case was poorly handled by the LAPD, it seems. The lead investigator, Mayor, I want to say, never really investigated a lot of different leads, just pretty much came in, looked at the crime scene, and said, it looks like a failed burglary. What probably happened was they tried to break into the home. Sherry saw them, somehow escalated the situation. Maybe she tried to fight back in some way. Things just got out of hand and she was murdered. When the only thing missing from the home, if, we're following the failed burglary line of reasoning, the only thing missing from the home was the marriage license or wedding certificate. But anyway, and then a month or 2 later, I believe, there's another burglary that happens blocks from the condo that John and Sherry lived in. And so the police force kind of uses this to give their story more credibility, because they say, well, so our 2 main suspects for this murder investigation are these 2 Latino men that were caught breaking into this home. I really forget what comes of that lead, but basically it was not those men that were the murderers in this case. So really, decades go by, nothing really happens with the murder, nothing gets solved. John, Sherry's husband, he moves away somewhere else, doesn't really stay around, fight for the case to be solved. It's really Sherry's parents that kind of pressure the city of LA to investigate their daughter's murder more thoroughly. And the case ends up being cracked because there's this new investigator, I think, or like recently promoted investigator, who randomly finds they've been going through cold case files trying to solve them, just kind of like reading through them to see if there's any misleads, anything that they can see where it's like a case that maybe we can go back and tie up now that it's been years later. This murder happened in 1984, 1986. So this development happened just a few years ago. So they're hoping now with new technology and fresh eyes, they can go back and solve cases that maybe were unsolvable at the time. So this investigator goes back, finds this case file, and they're looking through it, and they end up seeing that back in the 80s, someone had swabbed the bite mark on Sherry's arm, but because the technology wasn't really there, they could only test for blood type and not DNA, and didn't really get anything with the blood type evidence. So either a different investigator who's also really invested in solving this case or solving cold cases, or the same investigator, I'm sorry, I can't remember, goes back to try to dig up this bite mark. And the bite mark had kind of been incorrectly labeled and really messily packaged and put away. So it ends up taking a little digging and like a few extra calls to be able to find the bite mark. And so they've got that DNA on file now. And another thing that investigators have noticed as they're going back through this case that they find really interesting is that back when Sherry was murdered and people were asking, friends and family, do you know anything who would have something against Sherry? While John, her husband, was saying no, like nobody had anything against Sherry. Her coworkers and her family members mentioned that there was a policewoman on the LAPD who was an ex-girlfriend of John's who came by, like, she couldn't seem to really let go of the relationship that she had with John. There were a few times where she would stop by the house while they were home to ask random favors of John, like, oh, can you wax my skis? And then there was one time definitely where this policewoman, Stephanie Lazarus, shows up at Sherry's work. She was a nursing administrator, I believe, with a religiously affiliated hospital. Anyway, so Stephanie shows up at Sherry's work, and nobody really knows how that conversation went, because Stephanie hasn't said anything, and Sherry's certainly not saying anything, but Stephanie apparently shows up to her office, like dressed provocatively or something, talks to Sherry in private, and when she leaves, Sherry's crying, very visibly upset, and tells only like her parents and like her very best friend what has happened. Also, as they're going back and re-interviewing people, John ends up to admitting that while he and Sherry were engaged, he slept with Stephanie once, because all through college they had kind of an on-again, off-again relationship where Stephanie was obviously much more invested in their relationship than John was, and basically she just kept coming around. And so it was like a year or so had passed, they hadn't seen each other. Stephanie, comes back into town or something like this, finds out that John is now engaged to this other woman, and I think Stephanie had kind of been saying he wasn't going to commit to her because he just wasn't that kind of person. She gets really upset because apparently he is the kind of person who can commit. So they end up sleeping together. It's a mess. I don't think Sherry told anyone about that. I think this ends up coming out in John's confession. But anyway, so once the police that are reinvestigating this case find out about this Stephanie Lazarus, who is an LAPD officer. She's a detective, I believe, working in the art history unit, whatever you call that, at the time of this investigation, and they find out that she's never really been investigated. They kind of only focused on it was a failed burglary attempt. They end up trailing her for like a week until they're able to pick up like a cup she throws away she like goes to Costco with her child, because at this point she's married and has a kid. She throws the cup away, they get her cup, and that's how they get her DNA. And so at first they call her in and they kind of trick her, because again, she's an officer, or detective rather. They trick her into coming into, she thinks that she's going to be interrogating somebody who is a potential art thief, but ends up, things turn around. It's really an interrogation against her about this cold case regarding Sherry Rasmussen. And Stephanie is able to, like, I know my rights, barely talks to them, walks out of that, but ends up later being arrested, and now is in prison because she is found to be the murderer of, she's Sherry's murderer. Her DNA was in the bite mark on her arm. And while the gun was the cause of death for Sherry, and while the murder weapon was never recovered, it is known that one of Stephanie's registered weapons with the LAPD was potentially and most likely the kind of gun that they were looking for as the murder weapon. And so that's the case of Sherry Rasmussen's murder and Stephanie Lazarus as her murderer. So now let's discuss a little bit more about what this book got wrong in its exploration of this case. First of all, this book appears to be a rather ordinary size. However, it's printed on like Bible thin pages. So while it looks like it's maybe 300, 400 pages long maximum, it is about 700 pages. So it's actually very hefty, which was part of what took me so long to read, because it's a really thick book. And I'm not going to say his last. I usually call authors by their last name, but since I don't know how to say it, I'm going to call him Matthew, like we're friends. Matthew, I felt, was way too over detailed with this case. Like, goes back and paints a story of Sherry's early childhood and John's childhood and Stephanie's childhood, which is just exhaustive details that to me weren't really interesting, because I didn't go in knowing anything about this case. I just picked it up because I enjoy true crime and thought that it would be something interesting just to read. Also, I found it kind of odd that Matthew really has a clear bias towards Sherry, like never says anything negative about her, always paints her as like this most glorious, angelic pillar of the community, which I'm sure she was a lovely person, but it just seemed a little over the top at times, how he would go on and on and on about how wonderful she was, what a great person she was. And there were also some things where Matthew was kind of suggesting or implying things, but he was never really brave enough to come out and say it. For example, throughout the book, he implies heavily that John, Sherry's husband, might have had some involvement in the murder, because he really plays up how slimy John seemed to come across in interviews, how John didn't really seem to care after his wife died, but he never really says, I'm gonna like prove to you through this and this why John might have had involvement that we still don't know about in his wife's murder. Also, it's very heavily implied throughout the entire book that the LAPD was trying to cover up this case and was trying to protect Stephanie as one of their own. But again, it's never really said, I'm going to use this to illustrate and to prove my point that the LAPD is or was at the time corrupt and was covering up this murder investigation to protect one of their own officers. Even though at the end, the very last chapter is actually not about Sherry's murder at all. It's about a different woman's murder. And it talks about how she's also a cold case investigation, never been solved. She was murdered, I believe, shortly after Sherry was. The same lead investigator on that case was Mayer, who was the investigator on Sherry's case as well. And so that kind of made it seem like he was going to say that the LAPD was corrupt, but he never really made that point. He did say that Sherry's parents did end up suing LA, trying to accuse them of covering up this, trying to accuse them of covering up Stephanie's murder, but the statute of limitations had passed, and so their case ended up being dismissed. Also, something that was very frustrating about this book, it's not until the epilogue, and it is in that epilogue that it discusses the arrest and conviction of Stephanie, the murderer, which, if so much of your book is devoted just to talking about shoddy investigation and patchy forensic science, and your conviction is only like the last few pages of the book, it does not really make for exciting reading. It would be, I think, more exciting to kind of go back from the end and being like, so this is how the case was solved. Now let's go back and maybe look at how it could have been solved sooner by talking about everything that they did wrong. Also, as I said, I went into this book blindly. I didn't know anything about this case when I started reading, but Matthew kind of makes an assumption that you do know about the case, because from the beginning, it's pretty obvious as he's talking about the different people involved. It's pretty obvious that Stephanie is the murderer, and he wants you to know that Stephanie is the murderer, which also made it very unexciting to read because there was no me trying to figure out what happened. And I understand that, like, it's an investigation that happened years ago and a cold case investigation that opened like decades ago, so it's not really like spoiler alert. But I think for narrative's sake, when you're writing a book, there should be a little bit more mystery. There should be a little bit more intrigue that's trying to draw you into the story, instead of me just being like, oh my God, 700 pages of when will they figure out that Stephanie is the murderer. Anyway, I digress. That was that book, the second and last book that I read this month. There is another book that I guess I might finish before April, but I'll just include it in my April wrap up so this video is filmed now. And get to planning. I have something hopefully exciting coming up. I have a series that I want to start doing on my channel, so that's what my next video this month will be, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!